I still remember that day when we decided to climb Mount Sumbing, me, Amban, Arif, and Enko. We were all excited, filled with enthusiasm, as if nothing could stop us. The mountain towered in front of us like a giant, calm yet full of secrets. At first, everything went smoothly. We joked, laughed, and enjoyed the hike. But from the start, I could sense something strange. There was a silence at the base camp, an unnatural quiet. No other hikers, no campfire sounds like usual. But I said nothing. I thought maybe it was just a coincidence. That first night, I woke up to an unexplainable sound, like a gong being struck in the distance. It sounded faint, but clear enough to make me realize it wasn't the wind. Then faintly there were whispers, like voices of people speaking from underground. I glanced toward the other tent, hoping they heard it too. Their faces were tense, just as confused as mine, but none of us dared to speak. We just sat in silence, letting the night wrap us in its mysteries. The next morning, we continued our hike. But something felt different. My legs felt heavy, my steps slowed for no clear reason. I looked around, and the forest that usually felt alive now seemed oppressive. Amban, leading the way, suddenly decided to take an unfamiliar path, claiming it would be quicker. We followed him without question. He was the most experienced. But soon after, I lost track of them. They moved too quickly. Or maybe I was just too slow. When I turned back, the trail behind me looked foreign. No sign of them. I tried retracing my steps, but the more I walked, the more lost I became. Then, out of nowhere, an old man appeared. He was hunched over, wearing a tattered robe, his face hidden under a wide-brimmed hat. His voice was raspy as he spoke, offering me a bag of roasted singkong. "You'll need this," he said, smiling faintly. I accepted it without much thought. Fear crept up on me, leaving me unable to refuse anything at that point. That night became even more terrifying. I tried following the old man's directions, walking toward the path he pointed out. But the trail felt like it was circling back on itself, bringing me to the same place over and over. The sound of the gong returned, louder this time, closer. From the corner of my eye, I could see shadows moving quickly between the trees. A woman? No, more than one. Appeared and disappeared, as if they were watching me, urging me to follow. When I finally found my group again, they looked pale, shocked to see me. "Where have you been?" Amban demanded, his voice a mix of anger and worry. "We've been looking for you for hours." I tried explaining about the old man, the roasted singkong he gave me, but Amban's face went white when I mentioned the path I took. That path? It doesn't exist. No one's gone that way in years. Not since the last group disappeared. The second night was worse. We set up our tents and tried to sleep, but the mountain's silence pressed down on us like a weight. Again I woke up, this time to the sound of rustling outside the tent. I unzipped a small part of the tent and peered outside. Standing in the moonlight was the old man, closer now. His face was clearer, pale, wrinkled, and his eyes empty. He didn't say anything this time, just stared at me, gripping a wooden staff engraved with strange symbols. I froze, holding my breath, too scared to move. He stood there for a long moment as if waiting for something, then slowly vanished into the mist. Morning came with a false sense of relief. We continued our climb to the summit, but the path became stranger. The higher we climbed, the more off everything felt. The wind carried odd sounds like voices that were hard to make out. The gong sounded again, louder and closer than ever, and between the trees I saw them once more, the shadows of the women moving quickly and silently, always watching. As I reached into my pack, looking for the singkong the old man had given me, my hand brushed against something cold and wet. When I pulled it out, I froze. It wasn't singkong. It was a blood-stained piece of cloth, a woman's garment torn and soaked with fresh blood. Terror surged through me. This wasn't a gift. It was a warning. By the time we reached the summit, there was no joy left. We only wanted to descend, to leave this cursed mountain as quickly as possible. As we began our descent, I saw them again, figures standing at the edge of the forest, watching us. And among them, the old man stood with a wider grin on his face, as if satisfied. Then the ground beneath us shifted, as if the mountain itself was trying to swallow us. I screamed, but my voice was drowned out by the rumble of rocks and earth collapsing around us. The last thing I remember was falling into the abyss of the mountain, my scream swallowed by the relentless sound of the gong. I remember that day clearly, a hike that was supposed to be a brief escape from routine, but it turned into an experience I will never forget. Mount Lawu, June 24, 2021, was the beginning of all the strangeness. We, my friend Booty and I, set out full of excitement, unaware that this journey would lead us to an unseen world. We hiked calmly until night fell. A thick fog began to envelop the trail, and the rain poured mercilessly. When we reached Post 2, Checkpoint 2, we decided to camp there, although an uneasy feeling crept into my heart. That night was too quiet, eerily so, and something was lurking in the darkness. Around 10 p.m., I heard soft footsteps, like someone circling around the tent. The sound stopped right in front of my tent. I gathered my courage to peek out, and across the tent, I saw a black figure with a face as white as a wall. It stood motionless, staring at me from afar. My body froze, but I forced myself back to sleep, trying to convince myself it was just a hallucination. But the night wasn't over. At around 1 a.m., I felt something on my leg. A cold touch crawled, gripping my right leg. When I opened my eyes, I saw a woman with white hair sitting in front of my tent. Her hair flowed down to the ground, and her pale hand reached through the tent's wall, gripping my leg tightly. "I want your right leg," she said without speaking, the words echoing only in my mind. I jolted, pulling my leg with all my strength. The figure didn't stop, continuing her demand. "I want your right leg," she repeated over and over. With the last bit of courage I had, I kicked the figure with my left leg. Thankfully, she was thrown back, disappearing into the mist. I stayed awake until morning, trying to comprehend what had just happened. When morning came, Booty and I prepared to continue our hike. We didn't talk much, each lost in thought. As we met other hikers along the trail, I asked them about the trail conditions and weather, but it felt like our conversations were always cut short. There was a lingering unease in the air. Midway through our journey to Hargo Dalam Peak, we passed through Pasar Dieng, a place known to be a meeting ground for supernatural beings. There, I saw something that froze my blood, a horse's leg. It stood before me, large and sturdy, with brownish-white hair flowing around its knees. I didn't dare look higher. Its diameter was like a coconut tree trunk, and though only one leg was visible, I knew whatever was attached to it was not from this world. We continued our hike to the summit, but the uneasiness followed us. At position 4, during our descent, I experienced the strangest event. Suddenly, a sharp black stick, like it had been burned, stabbed into my waist. It felt like a piercing wound, but strangely, when the stick was pulled out, there was no wound on my body. Even my clothes weren't torn. Only a lingering stinging sensation remained on my skin. I knew this was no ordinary occurrence. There was some supernatural force at play. When we finally reached the base, I shared the experience with Booty. It turned out that he too had heard the footsteps and strange noises throughout the night, and he had seen my leg as if something was pulling it. That night, he even held a knife, ready to defend us in case something worse happened. After descending from Lao, a mysterious pain began to appear in my leg. I tried various treatments, but nothing worked. A spiritual friend told me that something had been left in my leg, a mystical heirloom. Perhaps that's what the woman in the tent had wanted that night. To this day, I still don't fully understand what happened, but one thing is certain. Mount Lawu holds secrets that I may never be able to fully explain. I can still feel every detail as if it happened yesterday, even though it was years ago. 3 days filled with fear, anxiety, and something beyond explanation. It all started with a simple task: finding a spring in the middle of Tiban Forest, Bottom. My foster brother, who owned a water business, had heard rumors about a spring flowing from that forest. And I, with my adventurous spirit still burning, accepted the challenge without much thought. That day, I set off with only a bayonet on my waist, a cigarette, and a Zippo lighter in my pocket. The locals had warned me, "Don't go, sir. That forest is haunted." But I dismissed it. To me, mystical stories were just folklore, nothing to fear. I had heard too many tales like that before. I started following a small river, tracing the water's path, which was no more than a meter wide. Sunlight still pierced through the canopy of trees, reassuring me that this forest wasn't too dense. But the deeper I ventured, the more something felt off. My skin tingled, goosebumps rising for no apparent reason, despite nothing being visible. I kept walking until I finally found the spring, crystal clear water, inviting me to bathe. Without much thought, I plunged into the water, feeling the coolness envelop my skin. But right then, I sensed something, unseen but undeniably present. My hairs stood on end, more rigid than before. I felt as though something was driving me away, as if the presence around me was urging me to leave. I tried to shake off the feeling, but after the bath, everything changed. I couldn't find my way back. I was lost. Every step I took brought me back to the same spot. The river, which had initially been a single stream, now branched into baffling intersections. I began circling the forest, as if it was playing tricks on me. Day turned into night, and as the Maghrib call to prayer echoed from afar, strangely in the middle of a forest, my body suddenly froze. I couldn't move. And then they appeared. Beautiful women, with clothes that slowly faded away, approached me one by one, seducing me with their teasing smiles. They came closer, but I knew they weren't human. There was something evil, something that wanted to trap me. I couldn't give in to their temptation. With the remaining strength I had, I whispered in my heart, begging God, "I don't want to die here." That night turned into a battle between a giant tiger that appeared out of nowhere and a massive snake. I couldn't move, only watch in terror as these two creatures fought before me. The tiger seemed to be protecting me, while the snake tried to devour me. I knew it wasn't real, but everything felt so vivid. The next morning, I was still alive, but my body was broken. My skin was covered in cuts from the forest's thorns, blood seeping from my legs. I didn't care anymore. I just wanted to leave that forest. Every step I took led me back to the same intersection, as if the forest didn't want to let me go. But I kept praying, pleading to escape before Maghrib. By the third day, I had reached the peak of desperation. I followed the same river over and over, and every time I thought I was about to find a way out, I hit another dead end. Finally, just as hope was slipping away, I encountered someone. An old woman from a nearby village. I grabbed her hand tightly, afraid of losing my grip on reality. She led me to the village, and just before Maghrib, I was finally free from the clutches of Tiban Forest. When I arrived in the village, I collapsed, losing consciousness until morning. When I woke up, the villagers asked what had happened, and I could only tell them the basics. "The Tiban Forest is indeed haunted, sir," they said. I didn't need further convincing. I had experienced it myself. Since then, I've known that some things can't be explained by logic. But one thing is for sure, I'll never dismiss warnings about that forest again. Those 3 days changed the way I view the supernatural and the hidden forces lurking behind the veil of this world. I still remember that night back in 2007, when I vanished from this world. I felt trapped in confusion, loneliness, and shame because of the constant bullying from people in the village. My life felt unbearably heavy. My father had passed away, and I lived alone with my mother, who always tried to comfort me. But it wasn't enough. People distanced themselves from me, as if I carried a curse. I sought escape, often spending nights alone, wondering why life had to be so painful. That night, as I sat outside, lost in thought, an old man appeared out of nowhere. His face was wrinkled, aged, but his eyes looked at me with deep understanding. "Do you want to come with me?" he asked. I was startled, but without thinking, I nodded. I wanted to escape all the sadness and alienation. The old man took my hand and led me into a forest. I didn't know which forest this was, but it felt like I had never been here before. After walking for a while, we arrived at a small cave filled with thick, sprawling roots. There, he told me to sit and recite istighfar and salawat over and over. Strange sounds began to surround me. A deep growl of a tiger echoed in my ears, but when I opened my eyes, there was nothing. Only the fierce wind howling. I began to lose consciousness. I don't know how long I was out. When I woke up, I found myself in a vast meadow, surrounded by tall grass and strange glowing lights flickering around me. It felt like I was in another world. I kept walking, confused, until I met another old man, this time a farmer, who was tilling the ground, though nothing seemed to be planted. He looked at me and told me to follow him to a nearby village. The village was quiet, with houses made of bamboo and straw, without porches or floors, just earth underfoot. They fed me, gave me a place to sleep in a simple wooden house. For days I lived with the old man and his wife, helping them in the fields, plowing and planting rice. But whenever I asked when I could go home, the old man would always reply, "Not yet." On the fourth night, something strange happened. I saw fireflies, the same ones from the cave, appear again. But this time, they weren't just ordinary fireflies. They swirled around, growing larger and larger until one of them entered my body. I felt as if something had entered and filled me, but the old man just smiled and said, "You'll understand later." On the fifth day, the old man finally said, "Now it's time for you to go home." Suddenly I felt my body lift, and before I knew it, I was back at the cave where I had first arrived. I don't know how I got there, but it felt like I flew in an instant. I hurried out and walked home. But when I reached the village, everything felt strange. People stared at me in shock, as if they had seen a ghost. "You're still alive?" they asked. "Inna lillahi. We thought you were dead." I was confused. How could they think I was dead? I had only been gone for 5 days, but they said I had been missing for 2 years. My mother had already held a memorial service for me, and they had given up hope of ever finding me. To me, this was impossible. I couldn't believe it until I saw the calendar. It was 2009. 2 years had passed, though to me it had only been 5 days. Everything felt so strange. My clothes were the same as when I left. My body hadn't changed. My hair hadn't grown long, and my nails were only slightly longer than usual. But everything around me had changed. The plants in the forest had grown bigger, and my village felt unfamiliar. A few days after returning home, curiosity overtook me. I had to know what had really happened. I went back to the forest, searching for the same cave. And there, I met the old man again. "How long was I here?" I asked. 5 days, he replied with a laugh. But then he added, "But in this place, 5 days can turn into years in your world." I went home again, never hearing from the old man after that. But my life was never the same. I knew I had been touched by something from another world. Even now I see things others can't. Shadows, figures, beings from another realm, sometimes appearing and disappearing in silence. People say I changed after that incident, and I think they're right. The world I left was not the same world I returned to. And deep inside me, I know there's something different, something I still don't fully understand. A group of 4 friends, Aditya, Brian, Sari, and Lintang, decided to trek up Mount Sumbing, eager to experience the majestic views and the thrill of conquering one of Indonesia's tallest peaks. They set out on a crisp, fog-laden morning, with nothing but excitement in their hearts. The trail was quiet, unsettlingly so, and the mountain seemed to whisper its own ancient secrets as the mist thickened around them. By afternoon, a soft rain began to fall, making the path slick. They trudged on, but soon realized they'd lost their way. The mist was so dense they could barely see a few meters ahead. Aditya, who had been leading, stopped and muttered, "This doesn't feel right." Suddenly, the sound of a gong echoed through the mist, soft at first, then louder, resonating from deep within the fog. "Did you hear that?" Brian asked, his voice shaking slightly. Sari and Lintang exchanged nervous glances but said nothing. They pressed on, the gong's eerie call pulling them toward an ancient path that none of them remembered from the map. As dusk settled in, the group stumbled upon a dilapidated cabin, tucked away in a clearing. Relief washed over them, and they hurried inside to escape the cold. Inside, the air was musty, and strange symbols were carved into the wooden walls. Sari traced one with her finger, her brow furrowed. These symbols, they look old, older than the cabin. Brian lit a small fire to ward off the biting chill, but the strange carvings gnawed at their unease. Aditya insisted they should stay the night, convinced they could find their way back come morning. The fire crackled, casting long shadows across the room. As the flames flickered, Lintang noticed something odd. One of the shadows on the wall didn't move, didn't belong to any of them. That night, as they tried to sleep, they were jolted awake by the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. Brian grabbed a flashlight and shone it out through the window, but there was nothing. Just fog. Suddenly, the door creaked open by itself, revealing a figure standing just beyond the threshold. It was an old man, bent with age, his eyes glowing with a strange, cold fire. He said nothing but stepped inside, his gaze locked on Aditya. The others shrank back as the old man placed a black sack on the floor. "I've brought something for you," the old man whispered, his voice like wind through dead trees. Aditya hesitated, then opened the sack. Inside were bundles of freshly dug earth and human bones. The moment the sack was opened, the cabin seemed to shift, groaning like a living creature. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with a slow rhythm. Sari screamed as a hand, gray and lifeless, reached out from the earth inside the sack, grasping at Aditya's ankle. The old man smiled, his teeth sharp and rotten, as if he had been waiting for this moment for centuries. "You have come to join them," he whispered, gesturing to the floor. As if on cue, the floorboard splintered, revealing an endless pit beneath them, filled with writhing figures, skeletal and half-decayed, their arms outstretched, beckoning the group to join them in their eternal dance of death. Panic gripped them. They ran, but no matter how far they went, the cabin was always just ahead. The gong rang again, louder this time, reverberating through their skulls. Each step was slower, like they were wading through thick mud. And then the mist parted. They were back at the summit, but they were not alone. Around them stood figures draped in ancient garb, their faces hidden in shadows, watching. Always watching. The old man appeared before them once more, his body now translucent, as though he were more mist than flesh. "You cannot leave. You belong here." Aditya, Brian, Sari, and Lintang were never seen again. Their families searched for weeks, but all that was ever found were their belongings, strewn across the summit, as if they had been abandoned in a hurry. And at the edge of the cliff, a black sack lay open, the faint sound of a gong echoing from deep within its hollow depths. No one climbs Mount Sumbing anymore. At night, locals say they can still hear the gong, calling out for more souls to join the mountain's ancient restless dead.